Living Outside the Box, Part 1b, Identity Politics. The rise of identity politics is growing more and more in influence. Groups, rightly or wrongly, perceive themselves as being oppressed or persecuted or treated unfairly. Some feel that they need someone within their group in all levels of governance and in corporate structures, so they will be represented. No one could or should argue that anyone should be discriminated against because of their identity. These days, there are many problems facing women in the modern world. There's the straight-out abuse of women by men. This is nowhere more egregious than in the Islamic world. In the name of Islam, women are being abused, even mutilated. The domestic issues that Muslim women face worldwide include husbands striking their wives, suicide, depression, humiliation, etc. There are stories all too often and all too gruesome to tell. Bibi Asha from Afghanistan had her ears and nose cut off by her husband after being tortured for 3 years. Before this, living with her in-laws. That was from 14 years on. She was featured with her picture on Time magazine. The rise of political Islam and efforts over the past 2 decades to impose religion on the people has meant thousands have been executed, decapitated, or stoned to death. And also this is if they try to escape from this religion. But there are severe problems with identity politics, of some which can lead to catastrophic consequences. The rights of the group has sometimes overtaken the rights of the individual. One observance and major grouping is that of women and men. This has spawned the Me Too movement. Again, no one can argue that women shouldn't be given every opportunity to pursue whatever endeavor they wish. But the premise that some of the spokespeople purport to speak on behalf of this group is flawed. The radical left-wing ideologues only operate on one premise, i.e. all decisions are made on the basis of who has the power. And men are those who always have and always will be in power. That men have oppressed women because of this power. No, this is not and has and not always been the case, at least in the Western world, in the Western democracies. Men and women have worked side by side, often with different roles, to the benefit of the families in which they occupy. Both have endured many hardships in the past. It may be true that some men are in greater positions of power, but only a few. The vast majority of men have to compete with other men and women to gain prominence. In the past, women also often worked raising children and looking after the house. It is only relatively recently that they have in large part been able to escape this role and join the workforce. But this is mainly because of the birth control pill, modern appliances, and other conveniences such as partially prepared food. Also, the premonition, or presumption, that power is the only reason one obtains preeminence is not true. There are many relative factors. Other things such as competence, hard work, intelligence, difference in men and women preferences, biological differences, are just as important. Take the biological difference. The absurd premise that there are no biological differences between women and men, other than the obvious. It's not true. Everything is not a consequence of social constructionism, that is inflicted by the paternal power structure. The most egalitarian countries in the Western world are the Scandinavian countries. They have made the most strident efforts to get a level playing field for women when applying for jobs. That have previously been the domain of men, or at least occupied mostly by men. The result was exactly the opposite of what was expected. Of more women pursuing these jobs, there were less. In other words, the social pressure was removed. Once that was removed, more women pursued more traditional women jobs, and more men the traditional men jobs. Women preferred jobs dealing with people, whereas men preferred jobs dealing with things like engineering, finances. The women went into nursing, teaching. It is therefore difficult, both on the individual and congregate level, to implement equal pay for equal work. How can you decide what is equal unless it is exactly the same job? Also, surely the more competent one is within that category, the more it is to deserve to pay. Since women tend to prefer people jobs and men thing jobs, it's hard to compare which are equal in general. Men, for instance, could argue that they, by and large, perform the harder or more dangerous jobs. How many people are killed in war? I'm guessing it's close to 100% men. Men work at dirty or black-breaking jobs, oil rigs and dirty mines, etc. It's also somewhat harder to calibrate people jobs than thing jobs. With thing jobs, one can count the number or the qualitative aspect of the gadgets being produced and compensate accordingly. With people jobs, it's more of a subjective call. Of course, there are some misguided attempts have been tried. Teachers, for instance, can cram students with facts to garner better results and better results on tests, rather than inspire children to maximize their potential, for instance. Secondly, since many occupations are dominated by women, is this not, according to ideologue philosophers, a conspiracy of women over men? So there seems to be an insolvable problem unless you want to live outside the box. Another proposal of the Me Too movement is that women are not represented in positions of power. And for the left-wing ideologues, everything comes down to power, or is determined by power. Those that have it are victimizers. Those that don't are victims of oppression. Their solution is by ensuring that women are represented, hopefully on at least a one-to-one basis, on all levels of governance and on all levels within a corporate structure. Great idea, you might say, to have all women represented equally. But who decides what women and how can or should these women represent all the women? How can a particular woman speak for all women? They certainly have not been voted to do that. I'm quite sure probably more women than men would argue that they don't. This also applies to the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, no one should argue that blacks should not have the same individual rights and not be subjected to brutal policing, which started the whole movement. The plight of the blacks in America were denied or at least prevented from their rights to vote. They were even restricted to work only on menial jobs. The civil rights movement is credited to correcting this situation. This should also mean that they should not be placed in various positions only because they are black. Again, how can an individual black represent all blacks? It's so absurd. What kind of black? There are black Indians, black Americans, many blacks from different economic and social backgrounds. Of course, if you think that all blacks are the same and that one can represent them all, that's different. This maybe was thought when blacks were treated as cattle during slavery. But I hope since slavery has been abolished, I hope we no longer think like that. But is this not exactly what is the case? And is this not then racist? End of part 1.